everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. I've got quite a number of things to talk about on today's episode, and I've intentionally titled this episode in such a way as to be specific, but also broad, like incredibly broad, because the violence in Gaza is still ongoing, and if anything, it's just gotten far worse. And we're talking like the entire population is hungry, is being starved. They're being separated from one another. They're constantly being displaced. There's constant bombardments, but also like just no aid going through, and people aren't allowed to leave. And on top of all of that, there is a very intense lurch to the right across Europe and across the US. But on top of that, there is also a kind of silence that I've been noticing, and noticing a lot of people kind of clocking out a bit silently. And I don't know, I kind of want to open up space to think about that collectively. The reasons for, first of all, if it is a thing. Second of all, as in if it's not just my perception. Second of all, what can we do about it? And three, to remind ourselves of the necessity to stay involved, because reasons that I will get into when I actually open up this subject. But before I get into that, I have just one big announcement. I want to give all of my love and gratitude to all the people who have supported this podcast. It's been about 7 months now, and yeah, I just really appreciate that there are people out there listening, and I just want to thank you. And especially to those people who have become members of the Patreon or have sent me donations through buymeacoffee.com. And I don't know, it's the most validating thing possible to open up my email and like, ooh, someone has gifted me some Eid cards, which is what I've named, instead of buy me a coffee, it's essentially buy me a Auntie Eid card. But anyway, love and appreciate you all. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. And yeah, I don't know, you're really giving me a lot of energy to keep doing what I'm doing, especially at a time where everything feels useless and it's hard to move in any one specific direction. But still, there is this urge for me to do something, and I'm really glad that I've developed this platform to be able to say some of these things and to share some of this analysis and to hold space for certain voices and certain conversations. So yeah, I plan on continuing, and hopefully with your continued support. And so that's the announcement. There are just a few things that I want to bring up before getting into the main body of this episode. And horrendous things. There's a sort of tacit trigger warning in all of my episodes because of the things that I talk about and tend to talk about. But yeah, I will be talking about some a bit intense things for the next 20 minutes, but more graphically in the next minute or two. And basically, the last week or so, I have seen so much footage, so many photos that are beyond description, that are beyond humanity. And there's almost like an uptick of these images that are added onto the pile. I saw someone write on Twitter, I saw that picture. And I remember saying that, I titled a whole episode about it, about the photo of the man whose body was completely just crushed by a tank. But in this instance, I didn't know which photo they're talking about, because only in the last week I can think of 3 incredibly, incredibly horrendous images. And they're just constant reminders of what people in Gaza are experiencing and witnessing and living through. The one photo, it's actually a video, which is honestly very difficult to even just vocalize because putting it to language almost feels like it cheapens. I don't know how to describe that, but it's a video of a boy's face. It's not a head. It is just the boy's face attached to whatever. And it's just, it's beyond description. I don't even know what to do with that. I don't know what people in Gaza, There's certain talk about a ceasefire now, but I, question sometimes how we move from here. I have no idea how people in Gaza who have seen these things, the person holding that boy's face, the brothers holding their siblings' body parts in a plastic bag, so many of these things. How do they go on? I have no idea. And the world is just so incredibly fucking cruel. I don't know, I'm still stuck on those original points where it's just, that's so entirely fucked, and there's not a fucking thing we can do about it in terms of, dealing with that reality. The second thing I want to bring up, which is also an incredibly disgusting and terrifying situation of incredible violence, which are these pogroms that are happening against Syrian refugees in Turkey. We've seen similar things in Lebanon. We've seen these things build up in Turkey over the years, but now it's really spilt over, and there's this very intense, literally lynch mobs going around and attacking Syrians and burning down their properties and just genuinely using genocidal language of a people who have already survived genocide, who are refugees from... God, it's so upsetting and it's so frustrating, and it is peak nationalist violence that is subjugating some of the most disempowered people in the world. No one, they have no representation. They have no one in a position of power on their behalf. They are in the ultimate form, and very similar to people of Gaza, the subaltern. There is no one in the chambers of power that is actually, there for them. They're left to themselves. And I think it's something that all of us really need to pay attention to, not just obviously people in Lebanon, people in Turkey, but this sort of nationalism really has a home, has a deep-seated home in Europe. And it's becoming very apparent now as well with the successes of far-right parties in electoral politics, but also the violence we've seen done onto black and brown bodies in these protests that are just accepted. More and more violence is becoming accepted from the state. And I think there's so much necessity in defending refugees for all of our sakes. First and foremost theirs. But I find myself already jumping ahead of myself into the body of what I want to talk about. But I just wanted to bring that up because I don't know if people are tapped into this stuff. I highly recommend following a page called Megaphone. They're an independent media organization from Lebanon. And they're really vital, in my opinion, to understanding some of these things that are happening in our region. And they've got a very good approach. They're very, I like them. For instance, they just published this thing that it was leaked on a Telegram channel. The legal documents or legal status, just information about the millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey. All of their information was published and leaked onto this Telegram channel. And with the intent of these are the people we need to go after. And it turns out a lot of this info is actually outdated, but regardless, it's a really scary situation for Syrian refugees in Turkey at the moment. And I don't know. Like with other places, I don't see the strong Turkish left organizing whatever that would be the only thing that would defend them. I mean, they certainly don't have their own, you know what I mean? Bashar al-Assad is not going to defend the rights of Syrian refugees. They have nobody to represent them. The opposite. The only people who are quote-unquote representing them want them dead. Anyway, the last thing I'll bring up is a video that came out from Vienna, actually, that's being shared within certain circles that I follow, of a young black man being brutalized by the police. And the story is so frustratingly familiar to people who are aware of anti-black police brutality. But I don't know, it was just him and his friends, and they were play fighting on the street, and the cops showed up and targeted him specifically. I think the boy's only like 16 years old. But the racism, the sort of brutality of it all, like this would not happen if these are just like white youths or whatever. And I don't know, it just does also make me think about how these systems of oppression replicate themselves. And there's so much denial of anti-black racism in Austria or in Germany, in Central Europe at least. Like there is so much of this discourse that, oh, it comes from outside. This is an American thing. I don't know. I find it crude and very difficult to approach that kind of discourse. And there is just so much work that needs to be done that is like foundational, that is very basic, that just even recognizing that racism exists and then recognizing that it's a problem. Here I'm specifically talking about in Vienna. And then it's a problem that needs to be fixed. And fixing requires work and dedication and commitment. But none of this can happen until there's at least a very basic recognition of the existence of a problem. But it really doesn't feel like people are at that place yet. And again, that's one of the reasons that makes living in Vienna so frustrating, where it's like, for most people, I can't even have this conversation because they don't even know that there's a conversation to be had. And especially when I'm talking to white Austrians, they have this arrogance that, oh, you don't know, like, you're talking about my country, I know what's up, you know, you're coming from outside, you don't know the discourse, you don't know what's happening, you're applying American standards or whatever. And I find that so fucking frustrating because I do generally think that people from the global south coming into these countries see things so much more clearly and see certain things and certain violence as much more, you know, standing out and as a problem and not just, yeah, that's just normal. God, that feeling of like being gaslit by white Europeans when you say something and they're like, yeah, that's normal. Like, no, it's not. It's really not. And you're saying something about yourself by saying it's normal, as in it's not a priority. Anyway, I think I've already touched on a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about in the main part of this episode, but I'm going to go through it in a bit of a sort of structure, which I've noticed this podcast tends to lack. I don't know if people like that actually. I do digress, and sometimes I like the way digressions go, but sometimes when I'm making a point, I don't know. I'd love to hear from people actually. Like, can you follow these things or do I lose people by my digressions? Because I do have a tendency to like go off on a certain tangent. I mean, here I am literally in the middle of a tangent. I do make a lot of effort to like bring it all back, but I don't know. To a certain extent, I can't really control it. And a lot of the things that I talk about are kind of just me talking. But this is something that I have been thinking about. And yeah, so I'm just going to start. And I'm going to talk basically about the situation at the moment. Gaza is still being starved. Gaza is still being bombed. People of Gaza, the Palestinians of Gaza, are experiencing unbelievable amounts of oppression and pain and injustice. And I have been noticing that fewer people are really engaging with Palestine. And I don't know, I could be wrong, but I'm not seeing the same protests that I used to. I'm not seeing the same energy that I used to. And I do feel like a lot of people are on their summer vacation or are burnt out and aren't trying to seek ways of like collectively healing, still centering Palestine, like they're taking a step back. And this on top of also situations of fascism and the rise of fascism in Europe. And again, like I mentioned, attacks on refugees, which is so embodying the hyper-nationalism of our age. Attacking refugees and doing pogroms against refugees is the ultimate form of kind of reclaiming or reproducing the national identity, the power status of being a national. even if you're poor, even if, you've been fucked over by your government and by the state, you are at least Turkish. You are at least Lebanese. And by being able to inflict harm and essentially to impose power over refugees, it is this really pathetic attempt at recouping some strength that is endowed by being a citizen of one of these countries or whatever. And so, in this moment that requires such intense action, what are we doing? I really want to talk about this. I really am not judging, and I'm thinking a lot about myself as well. I have definitely, especially, coming to Belgium and being with Hisham, I have taken a step back, and I feel incredibly shitty about it. I constantly, for the last 200, 300 days, just feel shame for not doing enough to end the situation in Gaza. I am not thinking enough or organizing enough. And at a certain point, I know I got a bit too connected because I was, in a very real sense, burning myself out. And I was just not able to function. And so I did take a bit of a step back, but I'm realizing that it's not just me. And I always knew this would be a bit of a temporary thing. And especially, with like increased talk of like an expanded war in Lebanon, I knew I had to kind of emotionally compartmentalize certain things. But I'm noticing that I think that's kind of across the board. And I don't know what's triggered it. Is it just that it's become, 230 days or so? Have people just lost, interest? Or they like burnt out and like constantly feel like we've done what we can and nothing's changed, so why keep doing, beating our head against the wall? One thing that suggests to me that there is just less, at least online, engagement with this stuff. And obviously there's a whole conversation to be had about the like flawed nature of engagement as political action, but I'm going to put that aside for a second. One reason that I am a bit convinced that this is a problem that exists right now is because on Instagram, there's a new format, there's a new tactic, let's say, that I've noticed Palestinians have been using in order to get their message out, in order to reach people, which is they embed their videos within another video that has like a 2-second instant eye grabber. You'd be watching a thing of someone like walking on slippery rocks by the beach, and almost as soon as they fall, it cuts to a video of a woman in Gaza, a Palestinian woman, saying, "Please don't scroll. Listen, you can save my family." And that is so fucking upsetting that Palestinians have to go through those lengths to reach people. And I think what they're probably finding, and what is more indicative of the case in general, is that it is easy to get people's attention, but it is much harder to keep their attention. And I think there's so much of the momentum initially that was kind of flawed. And I talked about this in an earlier episode about like, do protests work? Basically, there is a sort of aesthetic of protests that it's an instant thing, or at least it's a very quick thing, and it is the thing in itself. As in, if you want something done, go protest and it'll get done. But clearly that's just not the case, and it never has been the case, because protests are one tactic amongst many others. And what I'm really hoping that we are seeing less people, visibly, because people have been organizing, or there are more silent actions. I definitely know there are like direct actions. For instance, in Elbit factory, or the factory for Elbit, this company that produces Israeli weapons, they have done quite a lot of direct actions that are very cool and have a very direct impact on the supply chain of these, war materials, of these bombs, of these drones. And so maybe there's like a silver lining to not seeing as many people, because it's then, the energy is still there, but it's just not for consumption. This is also a reason why I'm a bit critical thinking about protests as the metric, because I think a part of the reason that, we think about these protests or we see them is because of social media and they go viral. But I think we've really been duped to think that something going viral is a good thing. It can be a good thing, but also I think it gives a false hope, or it gives this feeling that like, oh, something's going on. It gives the sense of the silent majority which will one day wake up. There's no silent majority. I think this is it. But anyway, I think some people didn't know what they were signing up for. But also I think some people are just genuinely stuck. I find myself in this situation now in Vienna and being like, what do I do? And I don't want to take too many risks because I'm a fucking immigrant in this country and I don't really know anybody and I don't really know the political whatever. I could be doing more and attending meetings or whatever, but I don't know. I mean, I am in a very specific case. I like to introspect because I think it's something that I can do very honestly and, factually, instead of like speaking about other people whose like experience I don't know and I can't speak to. But one thing that's really been fucking with me is the fucking whatever football's going on now. I am here now in Belgium and I'm with Hisham and he lives with a flatmate for whom, I talk a lot in this podcast of I don't go out because I can't stand to see people living their lives as normal. And this is my experience right now. I just feel so alienated sitting and watching him watch football or watch whatever or just live his life. And I can't even bring myself to have certain conversations of, well, I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. But then going out with Hisham, for instance, and then going and seeing all these people, again, for whom it's a choice, engaging or not engaging. None of these things are imposed onto them. Sorry, I don't know if that made any sense. For me, one of my most bitter reflections on whiteness and on white people is that they still have a choice to act and they're not. And the problem is a lot of these things we're talking about, collapse, fascism, the fucking apocalypse, it's like once you wait for it to be at your door, it's already too late. Or at least in terms of organizing, in terms of fighting back, in terms of surviving, it's far harder because you're already dealing with the reality of fucking droughts, of fucking whatever, police violence, of militia violence, I don't know. But so seeing people just live their lives as normal, as though nothing's going on, as though the far right aren't accelerating their movements across Europe, as though there isn't this climate collapse that's going to end it all, that's going to make whatever, that their own borders are drenched in blood, that they have made the Mediterranean into a graveyard. And they don't see this. They don't see border violence. They don't know refugees. And if they know refugees, it's not the conversations they're going to be having. But so there's been talk lately that there's potentially a ceasefire deal that might actually go through in Gaza. And it's a really fucked up situation for me as a Lebanese. I obviously want a ceasefire. Like, the bombs need to fucking stop dropping. I am also aware that a ceasefire deal and like a cessation of hostilities does not mean entry of aid. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be stipulated in the whatever, but Israel can pull its own shit because we know its intentions and its capabilities. It's not going to instantly fix like the complete destruction of the infrastructure. Everything, like hospitals, homes, where are people going to return to? A ceasefire is just not the end. But there's also this thing that the Israelis have been saying, that once there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they will mobilize their forces to the north and begin a full assault on Lebanon. So it's a really fucking bittersweet thing. And like, fuck the Israelis so intensely for doing this, where it's like, I can't even just be unapologetically like fully yay ceasefire, like, because they've put something in there where it's like ceasefire means war against Lebanon. And I don't know, that's really fucked up. Like the equation that Zionism has brought into the region and how it's changed all these things and how it's kind of just made violence almost inevitable to maintain itself is honestly something that, I don't know, that I don't think a lot of people, even in Lebanon, understand. And this is a whole thing, that there are people in Lebanon, like big voices, and not just political parties, but even commentators, podcasters, whatever, people on Twitter, who are kind of, what's the term people have been using? Have been cutting off their nose to spite their face. As in, they're super critical of Hezbollah, as am I, but are so blinded by just like the same political allegiances. I don't know. Basically, they say that like it's Hezbollah that is dragging Lebanon into war with Israel. And it is the exact same discourse that has existed in Lebanon for so many years, even before Hezbollah existed. This is the exact same discourse that they used against the PLO, against the Palestinians in the 60s and 70s. And indeed, this is a lot of the backdrop of the civil war. There is, especially from the Christian right, but also from other factors, especially people of like March 14. I'm not going to get into it. Lebanon's political landscape, holy shit. But it's enough to say that there are voices who are saying, that are essentially blaming Hezbollah for starting this war against Israel, and completely ignoring, for instance, one thing that's mentioned, which is Hezbollah, for what it's worth, has been very vocal. We will stop firing once there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Like, that is fine. Like, it is, if it's true, that is quite good. I mean, again, super critical of the fucking group for the last decade for so much of the bullshit that they've done. But they are meaningfully, like, pulling troops away from Gaza and, like, sort of creating this distraction. And I don't know. I don't want to get into it too much, actually. But there is so much discourse that is so bullshit, that is so disgusting from the Christian right, from so many groups in Lebanon, from so many individuals, that seems to ignore what Zionism is, seems to ignore the reality of Western colonialism as a whole, as a kind of 150, 200-year process in which Lebanon is very implicated. And we do not save ourselves from the violence of American empire, from Zionism, by just saying, we have nothing to do with this. This is the Palestinians' problem. Why are we getting involved? We've been involved since day one. I mean, just a little fun fact. There were Lebanese political, economic aristocracy, essentially, or like bourgeoisie, who were some of the families that were selling land to Zionist investors, colonists, in the 20s, in the 10s. The Sursuk family is a very famous example of this. And the Lebanese bourgeoisie, and especially the Christian right, have always been in allegiance, essentially. They don't really have a problem with Israel. But Israel has a problem with us. Zionists, I mean, do essentially, it's not just about Hezbollah. They do want parts of Lebanon. There are some movements. I mean, anyone who believes that Israel is fully satisfied with the borders they have today is completely naive. And I think this has been very clear since the days of Oslo. Like, take, for example, another big news story that came out just the other day. The largest land grab in 3 decades by the Israelis of land in the West Bank. If you look at Oslo, if you look at how they've divided up the West Bank, how they've even created the idea of the West Bank and Gaza, and have slowly been chipping away at it and taking more and more land and putting more settlers. I think there's about 1 million settlers now in the West Bank. I remember 10 years ago, it was like 500,000. But now it's just very clear. They want Gaza, they want the West Bank, and it's incredibly naive to think, okay, then they'll be settled with that. Why would they? Just today I was reading that there's a minister who comes out and says that Israel should reoccupy the Sinai, which, you know, they did hold for a period of time. I don't know. I find us all collectively in such a fucked situation. And the violence we're seeing in Gaza that is also being normalized in Gaza. You know, the violence that we'd experienced and witnessed in Syria that was normalized then and defended by many, and now this. And I think there's so much we need to be doing. I think it's very difficult for one person to say what everyone should be doing. And I never try to do that. I find it a bit frustrating, obviously, because I sit here all the time and say we need to do more and more and more. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, okay, like what? And honestly, I don't know. I know for myself, I know for some people around me, I know for some of the groups I'm a part of, but I can't say because I don't know people's positionality. But it's definitely a necessity because these things aren't just, they'll bomb the shit out of Gaza and then it'll end and then we can move on and forget about it. No. First of all, we cannot forget. It is just ingrained in all of our minds and hearts. And I think, obviously, for the people of Palestine, it's something that is just never going to go away. Specifically people of Gaza. But it is something that obviously, will just manifest into whatever incomprehensible expressions of this trauma. But for everyone else also witnessing, and for the things that have happened as an extension of it, it's not going to go away. Even with a ceasefire, it's not going to go away. And the kind of extrapolations, the rise of the far right in Europe cannot be separated from the open vocal championing of essentially genocide against a Muslim population, a predominantly Muslim population, an Arab population. And so if the Israelis are doing this, and European politicians are championing it, and European populations are by and large silent and complacent and just fine with it, maybe shake their head when they read about it in the news, but aren't going to do anything else, then what kind of realities are being set forth for Muslims, Arabs, and other minorities in all these contexts, for all the other subaltern of the world? And again, I think the violence that is done onto Palestinians in Gaza, many of whom are refugees, but who have been made 5, 6, 7 times over internally displaced within Gaza. The ability, like, if that's an accepted amount of violence and those tactics, that again, I didn't mention, we are seeing the exact same thing in Sudan. I was just reading about the genocide in Tigray since 2020, in this war between 2020 and 2022. Insane numbers. And it obviously is still manifest because a lot of the internally displaced peoples cannot return. A lot of the infrastructure is destroyed. A lot of the genociders are still in power. Some of them are still occupying Tigrayan land. And when you read about it, you just see so many familiar aspects that are just exactly the same as Palestine. This is exactly the same as what Bashar al-Assad did in Syria. And it is really scary. And I think the stakes could not be higher. And now is the time to act. And I do think some ways we perceive the concept of time to act is a bit harmful. Because there's a kind of mobilization that is predicated on instant gratification, let's say. We go, we protest, we burn the city down, and then boof. No. And clearly, no. Over the last 10 months, no. It has not yielded the victories we need. And does not really confront the situation as it is for Palestinians and for the subaltern of the world. I should have probably defined, because I don't usually like using terminology, but yeah, all the oppressed people who have no representation, essentially, and who do not really have any political power in the traditional sense. I don't know. For me, personally, the thing I'm going to keep doing, regardless of if I think it's making an impact, if I think anybody's even listening, for me, this is something that I need to commit myself to for myself and for whatever greater purpose I believe in, is I will constantly and continuously tell the truth, and I will speak my mind, and I will say things how I see it, and yeah, regardless of the situation, which is why today I saw people posting Roger Waters, and I don't give a shit what he says about Palestine. Especially because of what he says about Palestine, I hold him to account for what he said about Syrians, what he continues to say about Syrians, how he mocked them when they were being gassed by Bashar al-Assad, when he denies the mass atrocities, the genocide against them, when he plays into these conspiracy theories about the US and Syria and completely ignores what the Iranians did. But I guess I'll talk more about that in another episode. This seems to have been my longest solo episode. I did have a lot to say, so I hope you're all fine with this. And again, I hope you appreciated this episode. I hope I didn't digress too much. And yeah, I hope you continue to support me as I continue this journey into professional podcasting. And if you'd like to do so, you can become a member of our Patreon with the link below, or give a donation in the tip jar. And yeah, with that said, I'll see you all next time.